Have you ever looked back at a relationship and thought, was I in love? Or was I just emotionally kidnapped and fed spiritual tofu? Welcome, my friend. Because if you've ever felt like you were auditioning for the role of the fixer in someone else's emotional soap opera, congratulations. You didn't just date a narcissist, you were assigned one by the universe, wearing robes, holding incense and laughing softly. And you know the wildest part. They weren't even the problem. The real shock. They were just holding up the mirror. You were the one handing them the script, the stage, and a front row seat to your unhealed wounds. In Buddhism, we don't call this a toxic relationship. We call it karmic feedback with dramatic lighting. The narcissist was your syllabus, not your soulmate. But don't worry, this video isn't about blame. It's about clarity and a little humor. Because if we can't laugh about it now, we'll just cry into our herbal tea again. So let's take a slow, honest walk into the fire and find out what the ashes have to say. By the end of this, you won't just understand why the narcissist came into your life, you'll understand why you're never inviting one back. Let's begin. Part 1. The narcissist isn't your punishment. They're the spiritual scam you subscribe to. Let's start with something wildly unpopular in support groups and Sunday brunches alike. The narcissist didn't sneak into your life. They were on your guest list. I know nobody likes hearing that. It's much more satisfying to believe that you were an innocent traveler ambushed by an emotional vampire wearing cologne and a charming smile. But Buddhism and aging, frankly, has a way of stripping us of our illusions, especially the ones we've emotionally dry cleaned and worn for decades. So here's the Buddhist twist. You didn't just attract a narcissist. You co-authored the casting call, rented the stage, and left the backstage door wide open. Not because you're broken, not because you're foolish, but because, brace yourself, a part of you still believed that suffering was the doorway to love. In Buddhist teachings, karma doesn't mean cosmic punishment. It's not some mustached monk in the sky handing out demerits for bad behavior. Karma is just cause and effect. And in the story of your narcissistic entanglement, the effect came gift-wrapped in everything you secretly feared you deserved. You see, unresolved karmic energy doesn't knock politely. It kicks down the door, wearing your father's silence, your mother's criticism, your childhood's abandonment, and calls itself romance. Now in your 60s or 70s, it shows up again, but not to punish, to interrupt. Let's be brutally honest. Narcissists love vulnerability, the way termites love antique furniture. And aging, especially for those of us who feel a little invisible, a little forgotten, can make you the perfect target. You're experienced, yes, but you're also more likely to second-guess your instincts. Prioritize harmony over confrontation. Feel nostalgic for love, even when it hurts. So when someone walks into your life with charisma, attention, and a hint of mystery, your nervous system throws a retirement party and forgets to check the guest's credentials. You don't see a narcissist. You see a warm hand in a cold season. And that's not foolish. That's human. But let's not pretend we didn't hear the warning signs. As one Zen monk said, the universe whispers before it shouts. You just had your hearing turned down because you wanted to believe so badly. There's a woman I know, let's call her Linda. She met Daniel at a grief support group after losing her husband. Daniel was polite, well-dressed, and somehow always knew just what to say. Within 2 months, he was making tea in her kitchen and rearranging her self-esteem like it was expired furniture. He never yelled. He just corrected. He never forbade. He just gently disapproved of every friend, hobby, or independent thought she had. And Linda, bless her generous heart, called it love. Until one day, she caught herself apologizing for crying about her dead husband. That's when it hit her. Daniel wasn't healing her grief, he was feeding off it. So she did the unthinkable. She packed his overnight toothbrush in a bag, left it on the porch, and meditated for 45 minutes while he pounded on the door. When I asked her later what she learned, she said, I invited in a caretaker and got a character thief. But I'm the one who handed him the key. If you've ever asked, why me? Here's your answer. Because your soul was tired of being polite to your wounds. A narcissist is not your curse. They're your wake-up call, wearing lip gloss and quoting poetry. They show up just when your spiritual spine is slouching, and they say, let's see if you'll trade your peace for praise. And sometimes you do. You abandon yourself for someone who only loves you when you're starving for them. That's not love. That's spiritual shoplifting. Let me say something gently but firmly. You did not deserve the pain. But your soul was hungry for the truth hidden inside it. And the narcissist, they're like a fire alarm that doesn't save you from the fire, but wakes you up long enough to run. They came not because you were weak, but because you were ready to stop being fooled by charm in a costume. As the Buddha said, the only real failure in life is not to be true to the best one knows. And maybe this was the moment you stopped betraying yourself to keep someone else comfortable. So no, this wasn't your punishment. It was your curriculum. Your karmic seminar in radical self-respect. And you passed. Maybe not with flying colors, but with flying awareness. The narcissist didn't ruin your life. They just burned down a part of you that was never truly yours to begin with. And now in the silence after the storm, you get to rebuild, not a fortress, but a monastery of boundaries. Part 2. You weren't in love. You were in survival with style. Let's not romanticize what was basically a psychological hostage situation with scented candles. You didn't fall in love. You fell into a trauma trench wearing lipstick and hope. And sure, from the outside, it looked like romance. But from the inside, it was more like an emotional audition you didn't know you signed up for. And the only line they gave you was, I'm sorry, I'll do better. Let's take a detour into psychology here. That spark you felt, that soul-level lightning bolt, can't live without you intensity. Yeah, that was your nervous system recognizing familiar danger and calling it home. Buddhists call it habit energy. Psychologists call it trauma bonding. Ram Dass might call it God dressing up as your ex just to see if you've finally figured out the joke. You weren't in love. You were reenacting an old emotional script with a new actor. And honey, the casting was flawless. Let's talk aging, shall we? You've lived long enough to bury friends, watch people change overnight, and feel your sense of identity soften like an old flannel shirt. That's beautiful. But it also makes you more susceptible to what I call spiritual con artists in sensible shoes. Because loneliness in your 60s doesn't always show up crying. Sometimes it shows up charming. Sometimes it smells like aftershave and says all the right things. Sometimes it cooks you soup and slowly rewrites your memory of who you are. In other words, you weren't falling in love. You were falling into agreement with your own abandonment issues. Let me tell you about Marjorie. She's 72, witty, kind, a retired school principal with more wisdom than most yoga teachers claim on Instagram. After her husband passed, she felt empty. Not because she missed him, he was kind of a jerk, truth be told, but because the silence was deafening. Then came Greg, tall, helpful, said things like, you deserve to be cherished. And for the first time in 40 years, someone looked her in the eye when she spoke. So she let him in. Literally and emotionally, and slowly Greg began to guide her what to wear, who to see, how to think. One day, she caught herself apologizing for leaving the window open because it made him anxious. And that's when her Buddhist alarm went off. She wasn't in love. She was in survival mode, dressed up like a second chance. So she did something radical. She left a post-it note that said, I'm not here to audition for worthiness anymore, and locked the door behind him. In Zen, they speak often about the danger of clinging to illusions. Not just external ones, but internal, the ideas we construct about what love should feel like. Here's the kicker. Real love doesn't spike your cortisol. It calms your nervous system. Real love doesn't make you second-guess yourself, apologize for being, or wonder if your presence is a burden. If you're constantly playing emotional twister just to stay in someone's good graces, that's not love. That's survival stylized with candles and whispered manipulation. Part 3. Your compassion was weaponized because you forgot to sharpen it first. Here's a brutal truth wrapped in a soft smile. They didn't betray your kindness. They used it, like a Swiss Army knife with no instructions. And you let them. Not because you're naive or foolish, but because somewhere along the spiritual road, you mistook compassion for passivity. You turned your empathy into a doormat and called it growth. Well, as Ram Dass might say, we're all just walking each other home. But some people are stealing your shoes on the way. Zen wisdom teaches the middle path, the balance between compassion and discernment. But here's the thing. Nobody tells you. If you lean too far toward compassion and skip the discernment part, you don't look enlightened. You look like a buffet for emotional manipulators. A narcissist walks into your life like a hungry ghost, insatiable, needy, and wrapped in charm. They don't ask, "Can I love you?" They ask, "Can I feed on the parts of you that won't say no?" And if your boundaries have been sitting in a dusty drawer since 1987, they're about to find out just how easy it is. Here's the kicker for seniors and the spiritually inclined. Many of us were raised to believe that being kind means being silent, especially when things get uncomfortable. We don't call it self-abandonment. We call it grace under pressure, or worse, keeping the peace. But peace at the cost of your dignity, that's not peace. That's spiritual hostage negotiation. Let me be clear, compassion is sacred. But when it leaks all over the floor and you have no container to hold it, it becomes emotional clutter. Let me introduce you to Eleanor. Eleanor was 68, widowed, spiritually curious, full of heart. She joined a meditation group to find meaning in her grief. That's where she met Paul. Paul was the type who quoted Rumi before insulting you. He'd say things like, "You're the moonlight in my suffering," and then disappear for 3 days because you asked where the relationship was going. Eleanor, being the gentle soul she was, forgave. Again and again. She called it compassion. She said it was Buddhist, but what it really was, a PhD-level course in how to bleed out spiritually without anyone noticing. It wasn't until she heard herself say, "Maybe I was too attached to the idea of respect," that she realized she had mistaken spiritual bypassing for enlightenment. So she did something radical. She printed a t-shirt that said, "I forgive you, but get the hell out of my field of awareness." And she wore it to their last tea date. Paul never called again. In many depictions of Buddhist deities, they hold a lotus in one hand and a sword in the other. The lotus represents compassion, the sword, wisdom. The message is simple. Real love must have limits. Even the Dalai Lama takes days off and doesn't let everyone sit in his living room crying about their ex. Compassion without wisdom is like soup without a bowl. It spills everywhere and burns you in the process. Narcissists don't fall in love with people. They fall in love with access. They want your time, your energy, your emotional bandwidth, your availability without accountability. And if you're the type to say, "Maybe I just need to love them harder," then congratulations, you're officially easy prey in a spiritual costume. The hard truth is this: you were never too loving. You were just unguarded, and they knew it. Part 4. You were not supposed to heal them. You were supposed to stop apologizing for being whole. Let's rip the Band-Aid off early. You were not sent into their life as a spiritual ambulance, despite what your soft heart and decades of codependency might say. You were not born to be anyone's emotional hospice worker. And know your love was never going to fix them. You know why? Because they didn't want to be fixed. They wanted to be admired, worshipped, obeyed. And if your love didn't feel like applause, they'd leave the stage mid-performance and call you difficult. There's a difference between love and fantasy, between connection and compulsion, between a relationship and a DIY spiritual renovation project. If you were honest with yourself, your inner dialogue sounded less like romance and more like, if I can just get them to open up. They weren't always like this. It's not their fault they've been hurt. Let me stop you right there. You were falling in love with their possibility, not their reality. That's not love. That's charity with lipstick. And worst of all, you thought it made you noble. But really, you were just terrified of being alone with your wholeness. Let's look at why this happens, especially in later life. By the time we hit our 60s or 70s, many of us, especially women, have spent decades being emotional mechanics. Fixing broken partners. Softening sharp personalities. Over-functioning so others don't have to. We confuse love with labor. We confuse peace with pleasing. And when someone dysfunctional wobbles into our lives, we roll up our sleeves like it's the home improvement channel of the heart. You don't fall in love, you volunteer for duty. Margaret was a retired nurse, practical patient, and full of light. She met Julian, a soft-spoken artist who cried during documentaries and wrote her poems about souls intertwining. It all felt divine, until he started resenting her boundaries. If she didn't answer the phone, he'd accuse her of abandonment. If she wanted a weekend alone, he'd spiral into, "You're just like everyone else." Margaret, being the classic caretaker, thought, he's been wounded. Maybe my presence can help. But Julian didn't want healing. He wanted a stage, and Margaret was the audience, the lighting crew, and the exit door all at once. She finally woke up one morning and realized she hadn't read one of her own books in 6 months. She was too busy proofreading Julian's moods. So she left with no drama, no tears. Just one sentence: "I'm not here to be the medicine for someone who enjoys being sick." In Buddhism, one of the deepest truths is that liberation is an inside job. The Buddha didn't say, save your partner. He said, work out your own salvation with diligence. You can inspire healing, you can model truth, but you cannot do push-ups for someone else's karma. Your love is not a spell. Your light is not a leash. And most importantly, your presence is not permission to be drained. Part 5. You didn't lose your voice. You just kept whispering to be loved. Let's talk about the slowest heartbreak of all. Not screaming matches, not betrayal, but the quiet, barely noticeable way you began to lower your voice, to fit inside someone else's ego. You didn't lose your voice. You tucked it away like it was impolite. You silenced it every time you feared sounding too needy, too dramatic, too much. But here's the kicker. You weren't asking for too much. You were just asking the wrong person who wanted you to need less. In Buddhism, one of the Noble Eightfold Path's pillars is right speech. It doesn't just mean avoiding gossip or lying. It means speaking in a way that honors truth without harming the soul, especially your own. But when you're with a narcissist, speaking truth feels like lighting a match in a gas leak. So you dim, you soften your tone. You become a translator of your own pain, whispering it in a language they never intended to understand. And then you wonder why you feel invisible. Let's be real. By the time you've hit 60 or 70, you've been trained to keep the peace more times than you've been encouraged to speak it. Especially for women. Don't talk back. Don't make a scene. Don't upset anyone. So what do? You master the art of spiritual whispering. You apologize before asking for anything. You preface every truth with, "I'm sorry, but..." And a narcissist, oh, they eat that up like soup on a cold day, because silence gives them space to rewrite the script, and guess what role they give you? The mute sidekick in their one-person show. Let me tell you about Ruth. A former librarian, soft-spoken but sharp as a razor in a cashmere sweater. She met Charles, a man who claimed to be spiritually awake, but couldn't handle a woman with opinions after 8 p.m. At first, Ruth thought they were simply different. So she adjusted. She stopped disagreeing. She stopped correcting him even when he was obviously wrong. She stopped asking him to meet her emotional needs. because every time she tried, he'd get defensive and say, "Why are you so sensitive?" After 3 years, Ruth realized she wasn't in a relationship. She was in a monologue with occasional physical intimacy. So one morning she brewed her tea, looked at the bird feeder, and said aloud to no one, "I miss hearing myself." That afternoon she told Charles she needed space. He told her she was crazy. And that's how Ruth rediscovered the sound of her own soul, not in noise, but in finally refusing to whisper. This part is hard, so take a breath. Sometimes we stay silent, not because we're wise, but because we're afraid. Afraid they'll leave. Afraid they'll lash out. Afraid we'll be seen as ungrateful for the love we're surviving in. But here's the spiritual paradox. Every time you silence your truth to keep them, you abandon the part of you worth fighting for. And eventually, that inner voice stops raising its hand. It just goes quiet, until one day it explodes. Part 6. The most enlightened thing you ever did was block them. Ah yes, the ancient spiritual art of blocking someone. A modern miracle wrapped in a button labelled "No thanks." We like to think enlightenment happens in a temple on a mountain surrounded by chanting monks and lotus blossoms. But for many of us, enlightenment happens the moment we finally stop responding to that one person's text. You know the one. The "Are you still mad?" text they send 3 months after emotionally bulldozing your boundaries. Let's be real. You didn't block them out of anger. You blocked them out of self-respect, wrapped in silence. And in Buddhism, that's called non-attachment with Wi-Fi. There's a beautiful phrase in Zen: when the hand is open, it cannot cling. Non-attachment doesn't mean apathy. It doesn't mean you never cared. It means you care enough to stop bleeding for someone who uses your love as a mop. Blocking someone isn't revenge. It's energy conservation for the enlightened elderly. You've got limited time on Earth, and you're not spending it rereading texts from someone who treats your dignity like an optional upgrade. Let's be honest, when you're in your 30s or 40s blocking, someone feels dramatic, like you're starring in your own emotional soap opera. But in your 60s or 70s, you've seen war, you've buried parents, you've learned to floss with dental bills. You don't have the emotional bandwidth for people who drain you faster than your iPad. So blocking them isn't dramatic. It's called preserving your chai. And guess what? If Buddha had a smartphone, he'd probably block half of ancient India. Diane, 74, had a boyfriend named Ray. Ray was the spiritual type, talked about karma, wore beaded bracelets, and knew all the right words. But Ray had a temper, and Ray didn't listen. And Ray had a way of making Diane feel like her emotions were inconvenient spiritual detours. She spent years explaining herself, calming him down, and rewording her needs so they sounded less intense. Then one day, Diane read a quote that hit her in the chest, like enlightenment with brass knuckles. Peace is the love you stop chasing. So she made chamomile tea. She opened her phone, and she blocked him mid-sentence, mid-gaslight, "You're just too emotional." She said it was the quietest awakening she's ever had. She slept like a monk that night. Here's the deal. Narcissists thrive on access. Not love, not intimacy. Access. They don't want resolution. They want the option to re-enter your life whenever they need an emotional sponge. So when you block them, you're not being petty. You're cancelling their subscription to your nervous system. And that, my dear, is what I call spiritual pest control. Part 7. They didn't steal your light, they just burned themselves on it. Let's clear up a lie you might still believe they didn't break you. They didn't steal your joy, dim your light, or destroy your ability to love. They just mishandled your radiance and then blamed you when it lit up the parts of them they didn't want to see. In Buddhist terms, you were a torch. They were a shadow pretending to be whole. And when your light revealed their emptiness, they flinched and called you too intense. Let's not sugarcoat it. You didn't attract a narcissist because you were broken. You attracted one because you were powerful, radiant, and available. And that combination, it terrifies people who are built on illusion. You were kind, you were open, you were ready. But they didn't want depth. They wanted a mirror that only reflected what they liked. And when your compassion started revealing their mess, they did what all emotional pyromaniacs do. They blamed the candle for starting the fire. Let's bust another myth while we're at it. You didn't get more desperate with age. You got more generous, more trusting, more open to connection after a lifetime of doing things alone. But that openness, it made you vulnerable to people who saw your heart not as a home but as a hotel with room service. And the minute you stopped serving their ego breakfast in bed, they checked out and left you with the emotional bill. Let me tell you about Joan. Joan was 71, recently widowed, and unexpectedly radiant. Not in the flirtatious way, more like a lighthouse after a storm. She met a man at a grief support group who told her, "You have this energy, like you could heal me." He said it like a compliment. Joan thought it was spiritual alignment. But after a few months, that healing energy was being siphoned like gas from a parked car. Every time she expressed a need, he called her needy. Every time she had an idea, he felt threatened. Every time she set a boundary, he sulked like a wounded monk. Until one day, Joan said something extraordinary. "Maybe I'm not too much. Maybe you're just too small." And with that, she stopped apologizing for her light. She stopped trying to soften her wisdom into something someone else could digest. She stopped becoming smaller so someone else could feel taller. In Buddhism, the sun is often a metaphor for pure awareness. It doesn't choose who to shine on. It just is. And that's you. You're not responsible for how someone reacts to your presence. If your peace exposes their chaos, that's not your failure. That's their karmic allergic reaction to truth. Here's the deal. If they felt threatened by your calm, it's because their chaos had too much real estate inside them. If they called you too sensitive, it's because your sensitivity could see through their performance. If they called your honesty hurtful, it's because they were allergic to anything that didn't flatter them. Part 8. The real narcissist wasn't them. It was the voice in your head that told you to stay. Here's the twist you didn't see coming. You thought the narcissist was the villain. You thought they were the problem, the poison, the cosmic mistake. And yes, they were harmful, manipulative, and about as emotionally nourishing as cardboard. But here's the real horror show: you stayed. Not because they were powerful, but because there was a voice inside you. Soft, familiar, ancient whispering. This is the best you're going to get. At your age, don't be so picky. Love means staying even when it hurts. That voice. That's the real narcissist. And it's been renting space in your psyche since childhood. You know the voice I'm talking about. It wears your mother's tone, your father's silence, or your first heartbreak's residue. It's the voice that tells you to calm down when you're finally speaking up, calls you dramatic when you cry, says you're selfish when you dare to want peace. You thought you were trying to love someone else, but you were actually trying to win a lifelong argument with yourself. And you thought if they finally chose you, maybe you would too. In Buddhism, the ego isn't just vanity or pride. It's the constructed self, that scared, grasping voice that clings to identity, performance, and approval like a toddler with a juice box. It wants safety, not freedom. It wants validation, not awakening. And when you fell for the narcissist, your ego said, finally, someone to reflect back the worth I forgot I already had. But the ego lies. It promises peace, but it delivers loops, endless loops of performing for crumbs. Let's talk about aging. By the time you hit your golden years, you've been programmed with a million little ideas. Don't be difficult. People don't change. Be grateful someone wants you. And when you've lived through abandonment, scarcity, or early shame, those voices calcify. They become internal furniture, the kind you don't even see anymore. So when someone emotionally abuses you, your first thought isn't, how dare they? It's, what did I do wrong that isn't love? That's a hostage negotiation with your own unhealed self. I knew a woman named Cynthia. In her late 60s, smart as hell, generous to a fault. She dated a man who used silence like a punishment and compliments like bribes. Every time she tried to leave, he'd call her cold. Every time she stayed, she felt invisible. But when we talked, she didn't ask, "Why is he like this?" She asked, "Why can't I walk away?" And I told her, "Because you're not fighting him. You're still trying to convince the ghost in your head that you're worthy of joy." She cried. Then she laughed. Then she blocked him and bought herself a garden gnome that flips the bird. Enlightenment comes in many forms. So here you are, not broken, not bitter, but blinking in the light, finally awake after years of spiritual jet lag. You didn't just survive a narcissist, you completed a masterclass in remembering who the hell you are. This wasn't heartbreak. This was a curriculum. And you passed not by fixing them, but by refusing to disappear for their comfort one more time. The narcissist didn't give you closure. Good. Because you were never meant to receive it, you were meant to be it. In Buddhism, liberation isn't fireworks or a parade. It's the quiet moment you stop negotiating your worth with people who only love you when you're silent. You may not have walked out with applause, but you walked out with clarity, boundaries, and a soul no longer on discount. And the most sacred thing, you finally chose you, not the you they approved of, not the one who whispered and bent and begged, the you who watches the storm and doesn't flinch. So go on, light the incense, delete the number, say the prayer, drink the tea, laugh at how long it took, then bow to the lesson and bow harder to yourself. Because this wasn't your ending. This was your initiation. And darling, you're glowing.